On Wednesday, the Russian foreign minister made his first visit to China since the start of the war in Ukraine, declaring that Moscow and Beijing will move towards a, quote, multipolar, just, democratic world order. Well, Joe Biden, for his part, elicited both support and concern when he told attendees at a business roundtable meeting that there's going to be a, quote, new world order, which, according to him, the U.S. has to lead. So what does Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the international reactions to it suggest about the balance of power, or how world powers will confront diplomacy and conflict in the near future? For more, Emeritus Professor of International Affairs at the London School of Economics, Michael Cox, joins us for Perspective. Professor Cox, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Pleasure. Great pleasure.
So your most recent book, Agonies of Empire, American Power from Clinton to Biden, looks at how Washington's role in world politics has evolved over the administrations of 5 different presidents, from Clinton to Biden. Now that we're over a month into the war between Russia and Ukraine, do you think that the U.S. role is indicative of a great world power that's still able to shape international affairs, or does it indeed, in your view, confirm a declining influence?
Well, I would tend towards the first rather than the second, as we've seen the mobilization against Russia in terms of its invasion of Ukraine. That has come from Europe and from some European countries. But let's be perfectly honest, the prime driver behind that, and this is how the Russians see it as well, and the Chinese see it, the prime driver is the United States. There's no doubt the United States has faced a series of major problems over the last few years, the Afghanistan withdrawal being one of them. But what we're seeing now, it seems to me, is a rebooting of American leadership and a rebooting of American relations with Europe. Whether it will last, we will slowly have to wait and see.
Now, since the start of the crisis, Russia has sought full backing from China for its part. Beijing hasn't supported Western sanctions. It hasn't condemned Russia's activity. It's also, though, refrained from explicitly supporting the invasion. Can you explain China's position and what it has to gain by more or less standing behind Russia?
A great question. I've been analyzing this as a good academic for many years. Many years ago, I wrote an article which was really outside of most people's perception, actually arguing then that Russia and China will move closer and closer together because they have a very similar view of the world. They don't like the world being run by the United States. They don't like liberalism. They don't like the rules of the game as set by the West. And they don't like the dollar dominating international finance. And I think what we've been seeing over the last few years, and this culminated with the 4th of February communique, was simply a cementing of a relationship. Now, whether you want to call it an alliance or not, the Chinese call it better than allies. So we are seeing a really very important geostrategic link-up, which has been going on for many years and has been consolidated by this particular war. Although the Chinese are deeply worried about many of the aspects of this war, nonetheless, notice they are sticking with Russia.
Now, Professor Cox, you talk about how they clearly have common worldviews, uniting against the kind of unipolar world dominated by the U.S. But Russia, largely through the Wagner Group, has gotten involved in armed conflicts, not only obviously in Ukraine, also in the Middle East, North and Sub-Saharan Africa. That, to me, is different than China's model, which seems to be almost purely economic. So they're not exactly on the same footing when it comes to involvement in international affairs then.
No, that's true. They are very different kinds of powers. Put it bluntly, China is an economic superpower. Russia is not. Russia's main strategic asset, as we're seeing in Ukraine, is military. China's main asset is soft power, economic power, diplomacy. China does it very differently. But the way I see it is kind of, I wouldn't call it an easy division of labor between the two. That's putting it too simply. But I think both recognize the importance of the relationship with the other, however different each other are from each other.
But do you not think that Russia's military involvement risks destabilizing some of the very areas that the Kremlin is involved?
Oh, no question about that. I mean, Putin was given good advice, I think, by many people beforehand, not to do the invasion because it would end up, frankly, in the situation that he's finding himself in today. The really important question, however, is what's China's position on this? And although it has said, well, we want peace, we want mediation, and throughout the conflict, it's basically said that the cause of this conflict is not Russia, it is actually the United States and NATO. And that really tells you a lot about the strength of this ongoing relationship, which I think will survive this war. However, there is an issue. If it goes on for a very long time, the costs for China internationally are going to grow.
Now, with all the Western sanctions, companies pulling out of Russia, there's this idea that Russia is becoming a pariah state, that it's losing the information war. But outside of the West, do you think this is really the case? I ask this because Lavrov, for example, was able to meet with foreign leaders from Brazil, India, China, and South Africa earlier this month. He met with the Chinese foreign minister yesterday. Now, all of these countries seem to reject the ideas of excluding Russia from the G20. So to what extent is the West in denial about its influence outside of Western Europe and a couple of countries, a couple of major allies in Asia?
Well, I'm not sure they're in denial, but you make a very good point there. We've got to be very careful not to have a purely Euro-Western, Americo-centric approach to thinking that Russia's completely isolated. It isn't. It has China. Look at all the countries you mentioned. They're all members of the BRICS. You remember that? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, large parts of the global south, many countries in Africa who are either dependent on Chinese support, Russian support, will not always fall in behind the West or the United States. There's a lot of resentment, let's be perfectly honest, out there in the wider world, in what we might call the global south, towards both the West and the United States. And this is telling against building a wider coalition against Russia.
Now, I want to shift, with all of this in mind, to the role of the post-World War II security architecture. The UN, the Security Council, they're intended to guarantee peace. We've seen not only are they incapable of guaranteeing peace, but we have members of the Security Council starting the first major war on the European continent since the Second World War. Where do you think diplomacy has failed?
Well, diplomacy will always fail when you have one particular state, in this particular case, determined to use military power to change the balance of power in Europe. You know, diplomacy alone will never change everything. It can only work in conjunction with power itself. And when one of those powers in the international system, we call it Russia, decides for its own interest, although I'm not sure it is in Russia's interest, that's another question, decides to use force in the way in which it's doing, all the diplomacy in the world will not help. However, there has to be ultimately a way out of this, which will be diplomatic. So far, all the efforts at bringing about a diplomatic solution and resolution are falling down, and I think probably will continue to do so going forward.
Now, perhaps on that note, as a final very quick question, Professor Cox, do you think the model of the UN Security Council, is effectively brain dead, to use the words of the French president to describe NATO, or do you think it can be restructured to work more effectively?
Well, I think NATO's proven it's actually not so brain dead as President Macron suggested some time ago. I think, look, the UN is the best we've got. We can't reinvent it. It reflects power, it reflects division, it reflects competition within the international system. I think we simply got to stick with what we got and try and make it work better. That's a very weak answer to a very good question, but that's where we are at the moment.
All right, Professor Michael Cox, we'll end on that slight bit of optimism there. Thank you very much for your time this morning.
Pleasure, great pleasure to be with you.